Thanks very much, Megan, and I also acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the audience tonight, and thank you to everyone for coming along. We're going to start tonight's panel discussion with a little bit of context, using a couple of illustrations here up on the projected screen. Context is important because while we have a number of a few lawyers, amongst others, involved tonight, we'll be going a lot wider than just the law of native title in our discussion, as this topic, native title and Indigenous empowerment, demands. And if you're familiar with the book or take a look at it tonight, you'll see that very deliberately, as editors, we recruited perspectives from many fields beyond the law. So this first illustration comes from the chapter in the book by John Altman and Francis Markham, and it shows 4 maps depicting levels of Indigenous ownership and control of land over time under Australian law. So in 1788, Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islanders by right, under their law, occupied and used every part of the mainland Australia and its offshore islands. That prior ownership was not recognised by colonisers, and for nearly 2 centuries dispossession followed. So that by 1965, on the top right-hand side, no one owned land under the Western legal system by virtue of being the first peoples of this country. A widespread political movement then led to the creation of statutory land rights schemes from the mid-1960s, which, as the map shows, had the biggest impact in terms of land mass in the Northern Territory and South Australia. And finally, as gains continued to be made under land rights legislation, native title began to be recognised following the High Court decision in Mabo in 1992, having its greatest impact, as you can see there, in Western Australia. The second map, is that legible in this light, or do we need to? Yep. So the second map, which we'll use as a backdrop during our discussion, shows the state of play today. As a full-time member of the National Native Title Tribunal, Val will probably recognise this map from the Geospatial Services division of the tribunal. According to Altman and Markham, about 12.5% of the Australian landmass is subject to statutory land rights or Aboriginal reserves. So on that map, they're depicted in the colours: blue, green, ochre and purple. 10% is exclusive native title. That's the strong form of native title, depicted in dark grey on the map. And a bit over 10% is non-exclusive native title rights, and those areas are shown in the light grey. So coloured statutory land rights and reserves, dark grey strong form exclusive possession native title, light grey non-exclusive native title. Now, these forms of ownership are not uniform. There are important differences in terms of the strength of the property rights, as well as the way that they're owned and managed. For our discussion of native title and empowerment, a key point is how remote most of this land is. The map clearly shows how often the land available for recovery under these legal processes has been land that non-Aboriginal Australians have generally deemed to be of little or no economic value to them. In some places, this has changed, mainly as a result of exploration or mining activity. Now, at this level of magnification, it's difficult to pick up around 82,000 hectares of Aboriginal land granted under the New South Wales Statutory Land Rights Scheme. Those parcels are typically small, but valuable in a variety of ways to the people concerned, including sometimes commercially so. The map also does not yet reflect the outcomes of the very large Noongar settlement with the state government in the southwest of Western Australia, which is going through its final stages and is covered in the closing chapter of the book. Native title over sea country is also hard to see on that map, and I'll briefly show a close-up of the Torres Strait, where native title's been recognised not only in a terrestrial sense on the islands, but through a successful regional sea claim known as Akiba, a name that, of course, bookends the title of the book. So, in this map of the Torres Strait region, again from the tribunal, there's light cross-hatching there in the middle band of the map above this line in that region. And that light cross-hatching reflects non-exclusive native title rights over marine waters recognised by the Akiba decision. So back to that second map. I'll now briefly introduce our panel. Dr. Val Coombs is a full-time member of the National Native Title Tribunal. Val belongs to the Ngunnawal people of North Stradbroke Island. She's held a number of leadership roles in Indigenous organisations, including as CEO of Queensland South Native Title Services and chairperson of Quandamooka Ulubarabi Aboriginal Corporation. And she's an adjunct professor at 2 Queensland universities. Jason Berendt is a legal executive at Chalk and Fitzgerald and is one of Australia's leading native title and land rights lawyers. He's steered many successful New South Wales land claim appeals through the courts, indeed all the way up to the High Court. He's been involved in native title matters as well, including the successful Wellesley Islands sea claim in the Gulf of Carpentaria and the Githable People's native title claim in northeast New South Wales. He's a board member of the Law and Justice Foundation and chair of the Indigenous Issues Committee of the New South Wales Law Society. At the end of the panel, Brendan Edgeworth is a professor of law at UNSW. He's an editor of the book on display tonight from Federation Press, Native Title from Mabo to Akiba, and he's also written a number of leading texts on property law and legal change. And Dr. Leon Terrell is a lecturer at UNSW Law School. As well as being an editor of the Mabo to Akiba book, he's just published another book based on his own doctoral research called Beyond Communal and Individual Ownership, Indigenous Land Reform in Australia. Can you join me, please, in welcoming them to the panel tonight? So there's a lot we could talk about tonight. For example, the aspirations of Indigenous peoples for their lands and communities and the capacities to realise those aspirations, the posture of governments, the culture of the private sector, culture and conduct of the business sector, and the legislation and the court decisions that have helped define the law in this area. Before I turn to Val and to Jason for our discussion of the connection that native title and indeed more broadly land rights more generally have to the notion of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander empowerment, I'm going to ask Leon to get us underway with a little bit of additional context. So Leon, very briefly, could you alert or remind us to some of the major things that have been going on just recently in this area?
Thanks, Sean. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and paying my respects to their elders past and present. And I'm just going to give a very brief outline of some of the recent developments, really just to convey the fact that even though it's 23 years since Mabo, there's still a lot going on and still a lot being worked through. And in particular, there's been a lot happening recently in terms of law, in terms of policy, and in terms of agreement making. So to start with, in terms of law, in the last 2 years, we've seen 4 decisions on native title reach the High Court, starting with as the title of the book, Tessa Akiba, and later that same year, Carpety and Deepman. And then in 2014, we had WA and Brown, and in 2015, Queensland and Congo. So 4 decisions, all to some extent looking at the impact of historic acts on the extinguishment of native title. Also in the field of law, we've had an Australian Law Reform Commission handed down earlier this year. They handed down a report making 30 recommendations for changes to the Native Title Act to improve the way it deals with the recognition of native title, to improve the way it deals with connection requirements for proving native title. And in terms of policy, there's a lot going on there as well, with the real focus on economic development on Indigenous land, including native title land. So, for example, 12 months ago, we saw the Forest Review handed down. The Forest Review was mostly about employment and training, but it included a long section on Indigenous land, talking about the need for greater economic development, making a number of recommendations for reform, including suggesting that there needed to be greater individual ownership. Earlier this year, the Australian government handed down a white paper on developing Australia's north, and in keeping with the fact that a big part of Australia's north is Indigenous land, they had a lot to say about Indigenous land ownership They've committed $47 million to projects for enabling economic development, and they made a number of recommendations about making, among other things, native title tradable, which is something we'll come back to. The Council of Australian Governments, COAG, have launched an investigation into Indigenous land use and administration, and one of the reasons we're honoured to have Val with us tonight is because she's on the high-level advisory group to that process, which is going to be handing down in December. And the Australian Human Rights Commission has commenced a series of meetings on Indigenous property rights and what that means for economic development. So there's 4 current and recent processes, all dealing with native title to some extent and economic development and in that area. And finally, in terms of agreement making, the biggest thing has been the single Noongar settlement, which was finalised earlier this year, and that's massive. It's the biggest agreement we've seen with respect to native title. It's $1 billion in compensation. It's grants of land, access to land, parliamentary recognition. It's the subject of a chapter in the book by Glenn Kelly and Stuart Bradfield, and it's a very big. It's the biggest thing we've seen. But also more regularly than that, we've seen ongoing agreement making with respect to mining. The most recent has been a 100-year agreement between BHP Billiton and the Bunjima people in the Pilbara region. So 23 years after Mabo, there's still a lot that's being worked through, and it is still a very active time in what native title means for Australia.
Thanks, Leon. Jason, if I can begin with you. The focus for the panel discussion tonight, and indeed the book, is the extent to which native title and more broadly land rights has been a vehicle for Indigenous empowerment, politically and economically, and to what extent it can be such a vehicle in the coming decades as well. Now, you've been involved in this area for more than 20 years. Do you see land rights and native title delivering Indigenous empowerment, and what do you think are some of the biggest opportunities for that empowerment and some of the biggest obstacles as well?
Okay, well, thanks, Sean. I also would like to acknowledge Elders past and present and acknowledge the fact that we're meeting on Aboriginal land. In answer to your broad question, I was proposing to just discuss the concept, a few general concepts, and then primarily focus on the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Rights Act. The short answer is, of course, land rights and native title creates enormous opportunities for Aboriginal people. I think it's important to remember that empowerment can mean many different things to many different people. I personally see the concept of empowerment in the context of native title and land rights is really being about economic, cultural and political empowerment. And it's reflected in the way that governments engage with Aboriginal people and their ability to be involved in decisions affecting them at both a community and personal level, but it's also about the confidence of Aboriginal people to take action themselves in response to those actions. I think I'm very encouraged, and I think it's a very exciting opportunity that there is, a genuine focus from government and the private sector and a lot of Aboriginal people about looking at ways in which Land Rights Act and land rights legislation and native title can achieve better outcomes. And I think the idea that you can facilitate land rights and native title is being genuinely embraced, but I think it's also important to remember that in the context of these areas, empowerment is also the ability to say no to developments where you don't want them in your community, particularly where they're going to affect cultural heritage, which is important, or change fundamentally the way people experience their communities. A second general point I was going to make is, and it's apparent from the maps that have been shown, is that the experience of Aboriginal people across the country and the experience into the future as to what land rights and native title achieves for them will vary enormously, both because of the schemes that they have available to them, but also as a product of history. In the context of native title, the history of land dealings in Western Australia, for example, is very different from New South Wales. There is potential for very large areas of land to be recognised with native title rights and interests to varying degrees. And in some areas that will be coupled with significant economic development, which will provide real opportunities for Aboriginal people. In other areas, the extinguishment and land dealings will mean that native title will be much more limited. And if one looks at the map, I don't think it appears on the maps that have been shown, but the recent Barkindji determination, it will show that there's been a determination of native title over a very large area of New South Wales. But it's primarily a determination that native title doesn't exist, and that's because of the history of land dealings and earlier decisions that Western Lands leases extinguish native title. So in that area, although native title is very important, the ability for people to benefit in an economic sense from it will be very different to other areas. The third general point I was going to make was that, as a colleague told me, there's no straight lines in this area. And Aboriginal people will find innovative ways to seek empowerment in different mechanisms, and will just have to make and be the most of the circumstances that they have available to them. The Yorta Yorta people, for example, lost their native title case, but have been very effective in engaging with government regardless of that. And there aren't Aboriginal people in the country that don't recognise the Yorta Yorta people as the rightful people for their area, and they engage in land management and have achieved a large number of outcomes, I think, since that decision. The other sub-point of there not being straight lines is sometimes when there is empowerment for one group of people, there's disempowerment for others. And I think there's some unique challenges in the area of native title when you have regional claims, for example, and you have an end product where you've got to incorporate into an organisation to represent a diverse range of people. The structure of those organisations can be very difficult, and people can sometimes feel they lose their voice in those processes. I certainly think that many Aboriginal people feel alienated by the court processes of native title. They're run by lawyers, they're very complicated, and they're difficult to understand. As there's more determinations, I think when Aboriginal people have greater flexibility to exercise their rights, then the sense of empowerment would be greater. Another feature which is always, I think is problematic with all these schemes is native title starts from a concept of Aboriginal law and custom, and in many communities there are people with significant traditional cultural authority and under laws and customs are leaders in their communities. When those rights and interests are then corporatised into a native title process, there's obviously a lot of benefits in enabling a community to engage with government, but people who once had authority can sometimes be alienated through those processes as well and lose their voice. So those were the general observations I was going to make. In the context of New South Wales has the benefit of a very unique piece of legislation. It was obviously enacted before native title. Sean pointed out that you won't see the areas of land that have been granted under the Act on the map. I think it's about 0.1% of the state has been successfully granted, or granted, some of which has been transferred. But there are also, I think, some 20,000 outstanding land claims. The reason why the holdings don't show up on a map of that scale is because claims are made on a lot-by-lot basis. The Land Rights Act was enacted with the intention of providing an economic resource to Aboriginal people. For that reason, amendments were made to the Act in 1988, which allows for land to be transferred, sold. Land councils can buy land, develop it, and not many land councils, but some land councils have undertaken very significant residential developments to achieve significant outcomes for their community. That isn't an option which is currently available under other land rights schemes. Another unique feature of the land council system in New South Wales is that it is now self-funding. It was originally supported by a land tax over 15 years, but for the last 20 years it's been operating under its own resources, so they're not beholden to government for annual funding, and that is obviously a very significant position for land councils to be in, given the way that current government contracts work. The fact that the peak body is also a democratically elected organisation is also very significant, and if there's been some difficulties with the Land Rights Act. I think it's in part because of the response from government after it's been enacted. Although there is a claim process, many claims take a long time to be determined. There's also been inordinate delays in transferring lands and their assets that the community don't get to utilise because they don't actually have the title to them. I was dealing with a matter not so long ago where the court made orders 17 years ago that the land be transferred as soon as reasonably practicable, and it still hadn't been transferred. And so it's the processes then get truncated and stymied by some of those government responses. And I think another aspect which land councils in New South Wales have struggled with is I think they've been left behind in planning processes. I'm aware of a number of instances, for example, where claims have been the subject of court proceedings where the issue was whether the land was needed as residential land, but subsequent to the land being granted, the land was rezoned for environmental purposes, and so the asset has been greatly affected in those sense. So there's some of the particular issues. If we're looking at ways that the system can be improved in New South Wales, then I think addressing, the timing for the transfer of land and the ability of land councils to participate in the planning process, and I think they're also significant.
Thanks, Jason. It's very interesting. And Bal, if I can bring you in at this point, you might want to say something about that general link between native title and Indigenous empowerment too. I appreciate, but if I can also ask you a specific question relating to the Council of Australian Government investigation into Indigenous land. Apart from your work as a full-time member on the National Native Title Tribunal, you've been speaking with traditional owners around the country as an expert advisor to that COAG process. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about the COAG process and where you think it might be heading, and whether you see opportunities in that process, and also what about the risks or challenges that might be involved?
Look, I think there's always opportunities in process when you sit down to talk with governments. I think the interesting issue in relation to the COAG process is the relationship between state and Commonwealth governments. It's always intrigued me. I think when I was a lot younger, I thought the Commonwealth were the good guys and the states were the bad guys, but that's because I came from Queensland and grew up mostly in the Premier Bjelke-Petersen days. So we always thought the Commonwealth was about the only hope we had. But after going to university and working on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, I realised the very nature of the way the country was settled really restricts the Commonwealth's role in state government issues. And so, of course, the states, when they divided up into the Constitution, the states retained the power and the rights over land and Aboriginal people and various other matters, and that still seems to be the case. And so when you line up a Commonwealth process with all these different states, and each state has its mandate to try and make native title easier for the state, the COAG and the Expert Indigenous Working Group, which was a lineup of a lot of interesting people and people who understand native title and land rights, we had to basically have some principles, and those were the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and, of course, free, prior and informed consent. And then they threw the white paper in, which I thought was really interesting, that this northern development, and I spoke to a good learned colleague of ours, Kieran O'Farkley. He said, they throw this out every so often. The government talks about developing the north. But the difference now with developing the north is that native title holders are serious players in this. The governments, whichever they be territory, state or even the Commonwealth, if there's a native title claim or a determination, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are serious players, and that simply wasn't there before. So as far as empowerment, I suppose that's an example. The other thing that I was concerned about in relation to the government's focus on economic development was I don't know whether it was just from a Quandamooka perspective that I was a little bit paranoid and thought, well, is the government worried about native title settlements? Are some of these Aboriginal parties getting a little bit too powerful? Or is the government looking for native title outcomes to supplement essential services that government should be providing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their rights as Australian people? So I thought about that as well, and particularly in terms of economic development, I would have thought that the government has a responsibility for economic development in all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, and actually worked for the government when that was the policy prior to native title. So now we want to see real economic development in native title, which I thought was an interesting concept, so we'll see where it goes. But again, it's making sure that those essential services aren't compromised and government still fulfil its responsibility. No matter which way you look at it, land rights or native title, it's a complex process. It's a complicated process to acquire lands, to secure access to lands and its resources. There's never any shortage of legislation that you have to step through, particularly in the native title space. Of course, you've always got ORIC there because according to the Native Title Act, if you set up a prescribed body corporate, you can only be incorporated under ORIC. You don't have any other choice. Of course, the Native Title Act, which when you work in community and you try and explain to people what happens under the Native Title Act, people's eyes kind of glaze over, and I suppose that's lawyers in the room wouldn't be able to understand that, but I certainly do. And I know when we had our native title claim on Quandamooka, and it came the time when we drove around to see what land there was, some of it was radioactive from being filled in by the tailings from the mining companies. So, of course, everywhere the old people thought was a great place, we said, well, no, you can't go there. And somewhere else they said, no, that's actually a wildflower reserve now that the state government saw its way clear, or a koala habitat area, so they weren't allowed to live there. So trying to explain that process to our elders was challenging. And of course the good old Cultural Heritage Act in Queensland, which is associated with native title. So you've got all of those processes just for a beginning. So, and what to do with the lands that are held, the drawing down, and everyone thinks that overnight after your native title, well, all that land's ours now. Well, it's not. It doesn't work like that we found out. And also, for example, we got native title over a small island off Straddie as well as part of the deal. And there's a huge cypress pine plantation there. And everybody thought, well, that's good. We can just cut those logs down and build houses. And, well, actually, no. You're not allowed to harvest or cull the cypress pine. You can only remove the fire hazard. So in cutting trees down, we're removing the fire hazard, not harvesting. So we're trying to explain that to people on the ground, and it really gets quite complicated. But I think the most important thing, and that I see in my role at the tribunal, is the governance. It's governance over the native title process while your claim is on foot. And as we know, we have authorised applicants. Well, actually, it's members of the applicant, so whichever, it's a bit like your Form 1 application, it's Forms 1. So we have to make sure we get it right. But the governance over the native title process while it's on foot, keeping people informed, having people understand what native title actually brings, it's not the be-all and end-all, but the governance for the prescribed body corporate. Running a prescribed body corporate, as I'm the chair of our registered native title body corporate on the island, it is probably the hardest thing I've ever done. Now, I've done a PhD and I've run a rep body. And I thought that was challenging, but nothing compared to a prescribed body corporate, because you have everybody, it's land. And I remind my traditional owner group, it's land. It's always complicated because that's why white people sail halfway around the world to come and steal it off us. It is land. And they have lots of legislation in the non-Indigenous land space. And that's hard enough. But in native title, it really becomes very complex and complicated. And to try and give that to our community to interpret, I mean, I have our AGM on the 28th, which is this Saturday. So explaining the processes, everything that we have to do as a prescribed body corporate. And a colleague of mine who was on the board, Dean Parkin, he's trying to say, well, you know, everybody knows we've got native title and it's like a high-rise building. But everyone's waiting to see the high-rise building, but we're still building the foundations. I said, no, we haven't even got to the basement yet. So it's taken us 5 years lead in, and that is incredibly complicated. So what we're trying to do, and I thought was a good idea, we try to encourage some of our younger people to get involved with native title. Well, they want to run the other way. One of my nephews said, no, Aunt, it's like going to a bikie brawl. I thought, well, no, it's not. It is. And so what we're trying to do is develop a youth leadership in native title for our younger people to understand about cultural heritage, native title, mediation, negotiation, things like that, because there is a huge gap in the knowledge. And if we don't do it now, 20-odd years after the native title, we never will. But it's been really hard for me to try and get anybody interested in providing that training, because it's the state and the TAFE system and the Recognised Training Authority and all of that type of stuff. So really, you would think that it would be relatively easy. But no, it's an incredibly complex process that only that you love your mob, otherwise you wouldn't be involved with it. Honestly, it's really hard, and it's difficult because prescribed bodies corporate aren't funded, so you have to find your own money to operate, and even just to operate as a prescribed body corporate, to do the work that we have to do with everyone coming at us at once, costs us about $400,000 a year just in salaries. Well, we've got to find that $400,000, and that's a lot of money to have to find, as well as do the business. So really quite complicated.
Thanks, Val. And of course, with every native title recognition, there's a new prescribed body corporate that faces those challenges, and they're now numbering in the hundreds rather than the dozens in Australia.
150.
It's a very big issue. Jason?
Yeah, I'd probably just start by continuing on from that point, and that is that I think one of the very unjust things about native title is that, you know, for thousands of years, Aboriginal people have been hunting, fishing and gathering, and you finally get recognition of some basic traditional practices, but in order to exercise them, you've got to then incorporate. And there's obviously benefits with that, in that it allows Aboriginal people to engage in the wider community in interrelationship with those rights. But in effect, under the Native Title Act, you have a statutory requirement to establish a corporation, yet there's no funding for it. And it would be an interesting situation if all other landowners were required to incorporate, then meet compliance obligations under various Commonwealth legislation, auditing requirements, just to own their property. And I think that the fact that the Native Title Act was enacted without a mechanism to provide an ongoing source of assistance for those organisations was, I think, an oversight. Particularly as I think the practice generally is that prior to determination, it's not as though there's an established organisation, because the native title, the finalisation of who the native title holders there are in an area only get crystallised at the time of a determination. The general practice is that the corporation is usually created shortly before a determination, so immediately afterwards it's a new corporation ready to run. In that context, I think there's also some general points that can be made, and that is, I'm not sure of the figures for the failure rate of corporations when they get established, but I would expect that there's a high failure rate of a lot of organisations which get established. And there's obviously a risk with all corporations about mismanagement and incompetence that you can do your best to manage, but there's going to be difficulties along the way. All corporations have the capacity to be crippled by personality disputes and bad decisions. And a lot of prescribed body corporates, after they get established, will go through all those experiences, and hopefully over time they will get some continuity in the work that they do, and their board members, that they'll get better and better at functioning. But I think there needs to be an understanding that it's going to take some time. The point I was going to make about the Land Rights Act is that is another example where it's taken over 20 years to tweak the system to provide stability to land councils in the way that they're managed. When the Land Rights Act was first enacted, they didn't have boards or CEOs. They were designed as community organisations where the members would make decisions. And I think over time difficulties arose because there was a lot of difficulty in getting continuity in the management of it. Decisions were susceptible to change depending on who turned up at meetings. In 2009, they amended the Land Rights Act to ensure that boards operated, and I think that that's been a very significant change, which has been empowering for those organisations. And just for someone that's worked in the area, I've noticed a lot of difference. There's always obviously going to be a fair bit of regulation when you're a statutory corporation, and there's obviously always the difficulty in getting the balance right between the regulation, which will cost the Land Council to comply with, and allowing the organisations a level of independence. In New South Wales, all land councils are subject to government auditing requirements. They're accountable to the Ombudsman. They're reportable to ICAC. And there are significant regulatory controls which supervise their conduct. They're also subject to the supervision of the Minister. A lot of the Minister's functions are due to be transferred to the Registrar of Aboriginal Land Rights. And importantly, the State Land Council has a supervisory role, and I think that's a very important and significant function. And I think it's very important that the organisation that undertakes that supervisory role is itself a democratically elected organisation. I mentioned before that one of the unique things about the New South Wales land rights system is that property can be traded. It's not inalienable freehold, and therefore land councils are susceptible to the risks of bad decisions, fraud, whereby they have the potential to lose their property. And the Land Rights Act builds in mechanisms to at least provide a safety net. So in order for a land council to deal with land, there are certain requirements by statute as to how those decisions are made. The State Land Council then has a role to ensure that those procedures are followed, but the State Land Council also has the ability to not approve a land dealing on the merits if they don't think it's equitable or in the interests of the members. Under the Land Rights Act as well, that protection is then built into the Real Property Act, because a land dealing isn't registrable if you don't have a registration approval certificate from the State Land Council. And that then provides some protection that if bad decisions are made, the property will remain with the Land Council. And I think that there's been some land councils that, but for those provisions, probably would have entered into inequitable arrangements in relation to the whole of their property holdings. I don't hold out that as something that's easily translatable to the native title context, because I think that there's a very different context in the way that the organisations operate. But I think over time, when there are a broader range of agreements, and if people do go down the path of looking at ways of conferring on native title holders other forms of tenure which may be able to be traded, then there may be some look at balancing out those with similar provisions.
In relation to the comprehensive settlement approach, that's not new to us as Aboriginal people, but it would seem there was a lot of concern about the time it takes to get a native title process through the court. The federal court has a time frame, and I know at the International Indigenous Law Conference they had at QUT a while back, one of the traditional owners got up and said, well, why do they do this? They don't give us time. We need more time as a group of people to get across this and through it, and the court's got its timeline. So we talked about that, in that there isn't the time that you would possibly need to get a whole traditional owner group across the idea of the native title and to work it through. So that makes it even more difficult. But in 2005, Tony McAvoy and I had a legal services strategic plan, and part of that was the broader settlement type arrangement. We could not get anybody to discuss it with us. So it's good to see now that as far as settlement goes, people are keen to get it to the end. The other thing that's coming out of prescribed bodies corporate is the potential for representation in the form of an Assembly of First Nations, which has been discussed at the last 3 Native Title Conference. Initially it was to have it as an arm to the Congress, and that didn't happen in the first year. So there's a lot of interesting discussion there about true representation through the prescribed body corporate process, given there's quite a few now. The whole idea was that it be organised and funded and kept right outside of government, so that people had to actually fund it themselves rather than get into this process of what some people term, I don't, but other people term welfare colonialism. If you're waiting for the government to fund it, well then you're restricted in what you can and can't do. We've spoken at length with Indigenous Business Australia in relation to its role with native title. You've got an incorporated organisation in the form of a prescribed body corporate that actually holds land. So IBA is currently trying to work out not only its home ownership on Indigenous land, but its role in economic development for prescribed bodies corporate.
Thanks, Val. Jason, but comprehensive regional settlements and or constitutional change.
I might just stick with the regional settlements. Look, I think the issue with regional settlements, in part they're a part of a legal strategy. I think that one of the significant debates and one of the most contested areas of native title claims has been what is a society, and all the toing and froing over that over the last, from Yorta Yorta through to Akiba, to me has sort of come to the obvious conclusion that all people organise themselves at different levels and societies operate at different levels. I remember when we originally ran the Wellesley Sea claim and we started the proceedings back fairly early on in the process in 1996. At that stage, it really wasn't clear how the native title law was going to operate. It was pre-Yorta Yorta, it was pre-Ward. And we put the claim in the alternative. On the one hand, we argued that the 4 language groups were one regional society. They'd shared ceremonies. There was a lot of interrelationship between them. It was about the seas. It was pretty hard to work out where the boundaries were, although you could work them out generally. In the alternatively, the claim was brought on behalf of each of the language groups. And then in the alternative again, it was brought on each of the dissent groups. And in the end, the judge in that particular case held that he was going to recognise the native title on the basis of the language group, and that's what the determination says. But that was a level of political organisation of communities who really didn't have any concept of the Western legal system or what native title was, but were just expressing the assertion of their traditional interests. Obviously, before native title, Aboriginal people have organised themselves in a variety of ways politically. The New South Wales Land Rights Act, to come back to that, has a system of local land councils as well as a state land council. So I think the concept of the regional claims that have picked up prominence now, they're a very useful way to bring proceedings because it allows for some of the disputes about boundaries to be worked out internally rather than sorting them out individually. A variation on that is on the north coast of New South Wales, where the Githable claim is. The Githable people are really a part of a broad, you could argue, a part of a broader block of Western Bundjalung Yugambeh people, and there is also a Yagal determination, which are part of the same cultural block, and they're looking at other determinations in that area. And those people are obviously very fiercely assertive of their independent identity, even though for other purposes they will act collectively. In terms of agreements, I think it's also important to remember that the Native Title Act, I think when it was enacted, and certainly the original Act anticipated agreements. There was a lot of academic writings about comprehensive settlements in Canada that people had their eye on at that time, and I think there was always an acknowledgement about the potential to resolve native title through agreement, and now you had them, I suppose, more carefully drafted in the through the 1998 amendments, which introduced Indigenous land use agreements. And the scope of those agreements, do anticipate more comprehensive outcomes. The final point I'd make is that it sort of builds on what Val said, is that this is, for many communities, this is the start of a process where, for 200 years their rights weren't recognised. They've, in many cases, been involved in 20 years of litigation just to get a basic recognition of their interests. And over time, the opportunities might arise where people might be able to look at broader agreements to resolve outstanding issues. In particular, there's a lot of unresolved issues about the compensation provisions in the Native Title Act, and maybe they might trigger more agreements.